This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com, coming at you from the remote hinterlands of the Wabash River Valley, where the hogs, the frogs, and the dogs keep up a racket all night long. And by the innovation of modern technology, I'm here with a man from Montana. And he and I have something in common. We know something, not a lot maybe, but something about cattle. And we're going to talk about the laws of nature and cattle today. Cattle, Dan, by the way, Montana, Dan's the other elder in church with me. There are two of us. Dan, the other day, I ran across something popped up when I was doing research on the internet about cattle. And it was a documentary about cattle in America and how cattle have changed and made American culture very much different than other people, and how that we as Americans always have and still do eat more beef than any country in the world. We have a high demand for it. We used to go to war with sheep herders. We hated them because the sheep were cutting or nibbling the grass down so low the cattle couldn't get it. And that hurt people. And the whole story and all the movie industry and what they call the Western. The Western belongs to America and the flow of the story. Well, that's all about cattle. Without cattle, that would have never happened. Well, Montana Dan grew up with cattle. In Montana, beef cattle and milking cattle. And where I come from, my family leased bulls out to people, and we always raised a few cattle on the side. Montana Dan, it sounded to me like when we were talking a little bit ago, I asked you, I said, well, what do you do when you're milking cattle and you got all those bull calves and all those heifers, all those calves? You can't milk cows unless they have a calf. So you got all these calves. What do you do with them? And you told me you took them to the auction barn sometimes and different things like that. And but you said we kept a beef herd on the side because when milk was down, beef was up, and your granddad had noticed that cycle, and vice versa. So you always had some way to have some money coming in, and you wouldn't starve to death. Well, so what kind of cattle did you milk when you were growing up in Montana?
We had Holsteins. They're black and white and pretty big. They say that you milk a Holstein, you fill a 5-gallon bucket up, and you put a dime in there, and you can still see the dime. You milk I can't remember if it's Jersey or Brown Swiss. You milk the other one, and you get a half a bucket full, and you put a quarter in there, and you can't see the quarter anymore, or just barely. And then the other one, you milk a quarter of a bucket full, and you throw a dollar in there, and you can't see it either. So that relates to butter fat.
But the bottom line is the Holstein has a lot of milk and less butter fat.
Yeah, that's a little exaggerated, but it gets the point across.
Yeah, it gets the point across. So the Holstein produces how many gallons of milk a day with a 1,500 pound? That's what you said they are, they're up to 1,500 pounds. That's pushing a ton. And then the bulls are up to 2,500 pounds.
Yes.
They're big critters. Probably way more than a buffalo.
That they may be. I'll look that up.
Well, I'll talk while you're looking. Yeah, they're big. I know that. And we were talking a little bit ago about how dangerous they are, not because they have a bad disposition, but every move they make could be enough to knock a man silly or break a leg or throw their head around to try to drive a horsefly from their flank, and they have to hit you with their head. They could throw you quite a distance. And that happened. I had a cousin I was telling Dan that happened to. They had a Holstein herd, and she standing beside a cow, and it threw its head sideways and knocked a horsefly off its flank and hit her and slammed her up against a piece of oil field pipe that they'd put in a piece of concrete for fence post. Dan, the other thing is, we said if you're going to milk Holsteins or have Holsteins, your fences have to be made of steel instead of wood. Is that right?
Well, we never, we had steel gates most of the time, but we used wood fence, and we never had the Holstein bulls. When they were too big, too dangerous.
Too dangerous to even have around. Of course, there was a time when you did, because artificial insemination didn't come along until later. But
right.
Yeah. So there's more to people talk about dumb farmers and Ma and Paul Kettle, but there's more to it than meets the eye often. And just to stay alive and not get permanently injured while you're milking cows requires a little bit of extra knowledge. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yeah. Now,
I just looked it up, and a bull buffalo is about a ton.
2,000 pounds.
Yep. They're big animals too, but
a bull Holstein's 2,500, which is over a ton for you folk that went to the public pool system. A ton. Well, they don't teach this stuff anymore. A ton is 2,000 pounds. That's part of the English system of measurement, the common law system. By the way, just to reiterate, what we do here, and we do it in church, we strive to teach the laws of nature unwritten in creation, but visible and observable, and the laws of nature is God written in creation, the Bible. That's the meaning of those phrases from our Declaration of 76, according to the writers of that time, including William Blackstone. But if you go to the Bible, Montana Dan, you won't find anything in there about Holstein cows. But we do find a lot, Montana Dan, in the Bible, a lot about cattle and livestock. Matter of fact, it's a major theme and a major illustration throughout the scriptures. And to not understand a little bit of something about livestock is to not get the full orb, the full force of the narratives and the parables of the Bible even. And the words of the Bible, sometimes you'll see in the Bible, Montana Dan, it'll say cattle. Well, that Hebrew word in the Old Testament, often rendered cattle, really means four-footed livestock and refers to all flocks and herds that were commonly kept in the Near East at that time, including sheep, goats, different breeds of them, cattle, yes, horses, camels, the different words for different things, but cattle, oxen. In the Bible, in the Old Testament often, and the New Testament, the word oxen appears. Well, that's the word for cattle. And then there are different words in the Hebrew text. One means horned cattle. Another word means polled, stresses that they don't have horns. So all these things the Bible are very specific about, and we're just talking about some other specific things about cattle. Well, so your granddad said that it's good to keep a little herd of beef cattle and then a herd of milk cattle, and when milk's down, beef is up, and when beef's down, milk is up, and that way you've always got a backup that will enable you to put beans and wieners on the table while the markets are fluctuating. Can you comment to that some more? What does a cattleman have to know about markets to stay alive and not go bankrupt?
I just be persistent. Just keep them alive and healthy, I guess, the main thing, and good stock.
When you say fundamentally, you got to keep your livestock alive and healthy, of course you're depending on them for a living. What fundamentally do you have to do to keep cattle alive and healthy?
Well, you have to have good feed for them. you have to have good genetics, so you have to learn about that. You do that often with bulls. Nowadays you can do artificial insemination or embryo transplants even, and you can really get high quality livestock that way, both in beef and dairy. The dairy industry's used artificial insemination a long time. I was real little, I think my dad went back to Curtis, I think it's Illinois, and learned how to do that when I was just a little kid. And they were one of the first ones out in this area that did that.
Was the name of the town Curtis?
That was the name of the company anyway, but I'm not sure.
Oh, I see. Did you go with him?
Oh no, we were just little kids.
So he didn't hire
him and one of the neighbor dairymen went together to learn.
He didn't hire a veterinarian to do that or a special person. He just learned it himself.
Yeah.
That way you save enough money that it becomes cost effective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things that the Bible says
and timing. You got to be on time. Do it. Timing has to be right too.
The Bible says that a right-headed man is concerned about the life of his beast. So when I asked you a while ago, how do you take care of cattle? You said that's necessary to do, and then you talked about genetics but more fundamentally, what is it you got to do?
Well, it hasn't always been a practice, but it's becoming more. There's been around a long time, but studies of intensive grazing, where you go in and use the grass pretty quickly and then give it a rest, and you get a lot better grass, and it helps the soil be more productive too with the rest cycle. God had a plan when he put green stuff on the earth, because it's a solar collector and it helps improve the soil, and that's a whole another topic, and I know just enough to be dangerous about that.
But when you say intensive grazing, that means you fence off a tight area and you let them graze it down completely, and then you move them to some place. Is that what you mean when you say that?
Well, you take about half the plant, and then you give it a rest till it can regrow. So you're not hurting the roots, and you're invigorating the plant too.
And that's something that.
And you get fertilizer in a concentrated area too.
Oh, okay. And I'd never heard of that when I was involved in doing that. That wasn't something that ever came up. What we did was just a normal thing. You turn the cattle out. Of course, it's different in the Wabash Valley than it is in Montana. We'd turn the cattle out, and they graze about 10 months out of the year. Then we'd feed them hay for a couple of months, maybe 3, get them through the winter, and then they'd start grazing again. But we had a lot of grass. We get about 40 inches of rain a year, and we could run 40 head of cattle on 160 acres, hills and hollers.
That's about 2 years of moisture out here in Montana.
Yeah.
So maybe a little more.
So it depends upon where you are, how you go about doing this, raising cattle. Is that right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And then I was in the mining business down in Arizona, and I discovered the men that raise cattle down there, they'd put them out in the desert, and it was about 20 or 30 feet between bites. So they required thousands of acres for just a few head of cattle, but there was nothing else that land was good for anyway. So they just wanted to keep them alive, Dan. Just keep a little cow alive long enough to have a calf. That's all. Well, I learned different things. So I was down in the desert. I learned what they had to do. I'm not an expert on it, but I recognized, they had to adjust differently down there than we did back east. Out in Montana, it's a whole different deal than the deserts of Arizona and the lush jungle-like area here in the swamps of the Wabash Valley. But this video I watched, or I saw, was on YouTube, the documentary about cattle in America. The cattle that came here were from Spain, as far as we can tell originally, although some people have argued otherwise. Not completely, but the old Spanish cattle got loose, even when the conquistadors came to Florida. Some got loose there. And by the way, cattle ranches are still big in Florida, especially in the Panhandle. I've read about men that raise cattle down there. Cattle are big. There are big cattle ranches in the Hawaiian Islands, in Hilo.
The biggest in the world, I believe.
Yeah. And then we had, this is a little history of cattle in America. We had them in the East, of course, and they've always been part of our diet. But when the state of Texas wanted to build the present day Capitol building they have down there for their state legislature and all, they contracted, they put out for bids, and a couple of companies from the big cities back east put in bids, and one company from Chicago said, we'll build it just the way you want it, but we don't want any money. We don't want any money for building your state capitol building. Well, what do you want? We want 10 counties in West Texas. Nobody lives there. Matter of fact, still in West Texas, the county that has the fewest residents of any county in the United States is in West Texas. I believe 2 people live in the county. They wanted 10 counties, and so the state legislature cut a deal with the company out of Chicago, said, you build us a Capitol building, you can have these 10 counties, and they called it 10 in Texas. 10 in Texas. 10, is it X, 10X, or no, X? Oh, you'd have to look it up. There's a large ranch, and that's still, parts of it are there, but most of it sold off after the turn of the century. But they had that. Then the King Ranch down in Texas is 3 counties, I think. And then up in Montana, I know there are large ranches, Nevada, and the drive I've driven through, I'd say probably, I don't know this true, Dan, but I would say having driven through Montana more times than I can count, and the number of cattle herds I see, I have to think that Montana has more cattle than any state in the union, but I'm sure if they don't, they're close. Is that true?
Yeah, I couldn't verify that, but there's a lot more cows than people here.
Yeah.
Way more.
This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com. I'm here with Dan. I call him Montana Dan. He's the other elder at In Church, and we're talking about the laws of nature. I have a passion, and I think other people ought to too, for the laws of nature. That is the companion volume that God has revealed to us, along with the laws of nature's God.